The text started at 4:47 in the afternoon, while I was still 3 invoices deep into a vendor reconciliation and nowhere near done. Where are you? I was at my desk. Same desk I'd been at since 8:15 that morning, same as I'd told Carter before I left the house. I typed back still at work and set my phone face down, because watching the 3 dots appear and disappear was worse than not looking at all. I'd been with Carter Whitmore for 2.5 years. Long enough to know that the 3 dots meant he was rewriting the accusation, making it sharper. Who else is working late? I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to remember who I'd been before Carter, someone who stayed late because she liked the work, not because she was afraid to go home. 3 years at Cross Consulting Group had taught me a lot of things: financial forensics, contract risk assessment, how to read a balance sheet for what it was hiding as much as what it was saying. But the most constant education had been watching Holden Cross from a careful professional distance and making sure that distance never closed. Everyone in Chicago's business circles knew about Cross Consulting. On paper, they were a private risk management and security firm, legitimate, profitable, with a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies and a government contractor or 2. Below the paper, the firm moved through shadows I'd learned not to look at directly, the way you don't look straight at the sun. I'd accepted that on day 1. The work was real, the paycheck was real, and Holden Cross, whatever else he was, had never once made me feel unsafe. Carter made me feel unsafe 3 times a week now, and he'd never technically done anything. Until the night he did. I got home at 7:30. Carter's car was in the building garage, which meant the question of the evening was what mood I'd find him in. I'd learned to read the apartment before I fully walked in. The level of light in the living room, whether the TV was on, whether there was a smell of whiskey underneath the takeout containers. That night, all 3 signs were bad. He was sitting on the couch with his jacket still on, like he'd been home just long enough to get angry before he could talk himself down. Carter was a criminal defense attorney. His family had money going back 2 generations, and he wore it the way some men wear a watch. Not because it told time, but because it told other people something about him. When we'd started dating, I'd thought his intensity was passion. That took me longer to unlearn than it should have. "You didn't answer my last message," he said. "I was finishing a report. I set my bag down slowly. I texted you I was on my way home." An hour after I asked. "Carter, please, I'm tired. Can we not?" "Not what?" "Not talk about the fact that you spend more time in that building than you do here. Not talk about the way you look whenever someone mentions him?" I didn't look any way when someone mentioned Holden. I had been very careful about that for 3 years, but explaining it to Carter in this state was like explaining it to the wall. The argument escalated the way it always did, one raised voice pulling the next one up. Carter had been drinking. Not stumbling drunk, but enough. The kind of drunk that loosened things he usually kept tied down. When his hand came across my face, we both froze. It wasn't the first time he'd grabbed me, grabbed my wrist, grabbed my arm, but always in ways he could explain as emphasis, as frustration as you know, I'd never actually hurt you. This was different. The flat of his palm, my cheek, and the ringing afterward. I stood very still, my ears were humming. "Paige," his voice cracked. "God, I didn't mean." "Get out." My own voice came out quieter than I expected, steady, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Carter, get out of my apartment right now." He did, eventually. After the apologies, after the bargaining, after the version of himself he always trotted out when he knew he'd gone too far. The door closed, and I sank down against the wall next to the couch, my legs just giving out. I don't know how long I sat there. My phone was in my hand. I scrolled through it without really seeing it. My sister in Portland, my mom who'd been warning me about Carter for over a year. 911, which I should have called and somehow couldn't make myself. And then Holden's number, personal cell. He'd given it to me 18 months ago during a sensitive client case, said to use it any time. I'd never used it. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long time. It rang once. Callahan. His voice was alert in that particular way of his, like he was always halfway ready for something. "What's wrong?" Just hearing my name said like that, like he already knew something was wrong and was already moving, broke something loose in my chest. "I'm sorry to call this late," I started. "Don't apologize. Tell me what happened." I pressed my free hand over my mouth for a second, pulled it together. "Can you come get me?" I know it's a lot to ask, but Carter hit me and I made him leave, and I'm scared he'll come back, and I don't know who else to call. "Lock your door." His voice had changed, flat and focused. "Deadbolt, chain, everything. I'm 20 minutes away. Stay on the phone with me." I got up off the floor, on autopilot, and bolted the door with shaking hands. "Okay," I breathed. "It's locked." "Good. Talk to me. Are you hurt anywhere besides your face?" He'd clocked it that fast, that it was my face. He grabbed my arms before. "They'll be bruising, but I don't think anything's." "You don't have to minimize it." His voice was careful. Not soft exactly, just precise. "Tell me everything from the beginning. You've got 18 minutes. So I told him. Standing in my locked apartment with my heart still hammering and my cheek still burning, I told Holden Cross everything. The texts, the argument, the drinking, the moment everything I'd been telling myself. It's not that bad. He's under stress, he loves me in his way. Became impossible to keep believing. He didn't interrupt once. He listened the way he did in high-stakes negotiations, with his whole attention. The kind of listening that makes you feel like every word matters. "Paige." A knock at my door, his voice both through the phone and through the wood at the same time. I let him in. He was in jeans and a dark jacket, the kind of clothes that said he'd grabbed whatever was nearest and ran. Behind him stood a man named Soren, one of Holden's people, quiet and watchful, who materialized whenever Holden needed a situation handled. Holden's eyes went to my face first, then my wrists, then back to my face. Something moved through his expression so quickly I almost missed it. "Let's go," he said quietly. He took my bag from my shoulder without asking. And because there was nowhere else I could think to be, I followed him into the night. Holden's penthouse was in River North, 22 floors up, with floor-to-ceilings windows that made Chicago look like something you'd painted rather than somewhere you'd have to live in the morning. He gave me the guest suite, its own bathroom, its own key, and called his physician, a composed woman named Dr. Vasquez, who arrived within the hour and examined my wrists and face with careful efficiency. No fractures, significant bruising, ice, ibuprofen, rest. I stood in the shower afterward for longer than I meant to, trying to rinse off the feeling of Carter's hands. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry, because I had already cried on the floor of my apartment, and I didn't have any more in me that night. A soft knock, Holden with a glass of water and the ibuprofen Dr. Vasquez had left. "Thank you," I said. "For all of this, you didn't have to." "Don't," he said it without sharpness. "Don't thank me for the basic minimum, Callahan. It makes me angry at him, and I'm already angry enough." A pause. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you can tell me what you need." He was halfway to the door when I said his name. He stopped. "He might come back to my apartment. He still has a key." "He won't," Holden said simply. Then he was gone. I didn't ask what that meant. Carter had sent 41 messages by morning. I read them the way you'd read a weather report for a hurricane. Not because you can stop it, but because you need to know which direction it's coming from. The pattern was predictable. Apologies bleeding into excuses, bleeding into accusations, bleeding into threats. "I know where you went. Come home and we can fix this. You're making a mistake you can't take back." I set the phone down and opened my banking app because I had a bill due, and that's when everything tilted sideways. My checking account, the one I'd had since college, the one I'd opened myself at 18 with $200 from a summer job, showed a balance of $186. My last paycheck had deposited 9 days ago, $3,800. I clicked through the transaction history with fingers that went cold. Cash withdrawals I hadn't made. Transfers to an account number I didn't recognize. A Venmo payment for $900 to a name that meant nothing to me. Another transfer, $4,300. I pulled up the credit monitoring app I'd set up 2 years ago and mostly forgotten about. 3 alerts I'd never opened. A new Visa account in my name at a bank I'd never used. A personal loan, $15,000, listed as approved. A second inquiry from a different lender. I sat with that information for a long time. processing it the way I'd learned to process financial discrepancies. Not with panic, but with the cold, cataloging part of my brain that just wanted to understand the full scope before it felt anything. Then I walked out to the living room, where Holden was already at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee, and I said, "He stole from me." Holden looked up. "Carter." My voice was steady in a way that surprised me. Steadier than my hands. "He's been using my identity to open accounts, take out loans. There's almost $30,000 in debt in my name that I never authorized. I just checked my credit report." He looked at my phone, then at me. The expression on his face was the one I'd seen him use in negotiations. Very controlled, very cold, and underneath it, something that ran much deeper than either of those things. "We're calling the FBI," he said. "Financial fraud, identity theft that crosses into federal territory. And we're getting you a lawyer today, a real one." He paused. "Unless you don't want to." I thought about Carter's face the moment he'd understood what he'd done. How quickly he'd shifted into apology mode. How long, apparently, he'd been doing this before I'd known to look. "I want to," I said. The attorney Holden retained was named Denise Park, 16 years in financial fraud and identity theft, with the kind of direct competence that made me feel, for the first time in months, like I wasn't losing my mind. She walked me through everything. File a report with the FTC, freeze my credit across all 3 bureaus, dispute every fraudulent account in writing, obtain the loan documents through discovery, and have the signatures analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. I also filed for an emergency protective order. Carter was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me, my workplace, or Holden's building. I stayed at the penthouse while I figured out my next move. Holden had a housekeeper named Pearl, who kept the kitchen stocked and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He had Soren, who appeared when needed and disappeared otherwise. And he had, it turned out, a habit of checking on me in the evenings. A knock, a question, coffee if I wanted company. We talked about real things. Not work, not Carter, not the case. He asked me what I'd wanted to be before I ended up in forensic accounting, and I told him I'd wanted to study landscape architecture. He laughed, genuinely surprised, and said that explained why I was the only person in his entire firm who had ever complained about the dead plant in the 3rd-floor conference room. He started calling me Sunshine on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks in. I'd come out of the guest suite, genuinely laughing at something Pearl had said, and Holden had looked up from his laptop and said, "There she is," and after that the name just stayed. I told myself not to read too much into it. I was not entirely successful. The handwriting analysis came back on a Thursday afternoon, the signatures on 2 loan applications. Forged. The fraud investigator Denise hired traced the transferred funds to an account Carter had opened 6 months before we'd ever started dating, which meant this had never been impulsive. He'd been patient about it, methodical. I thought about all the moments over 2 years that I'd interpreted wrong. The joint checking account he'd suggested to make things easier. His habit of handling our shared expenses. The afternoon my laptop had been on his desk, and I'd assumed he'd been using it for work and hadn't given it a second thought. The federal investigation moved slowly, but it moved. The FBI agent handling the case told me my documentation was the most thorough she'd seen a victim put together independently. I wasn't sure victim was the right word. I was an accountant who'd found the discrepancy and wasn't letting go of it. 3 months after I'd made that phone call, Carter Whitmore was indicted. 4 counts of identity theft, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of forgery. His family hired the best attorneys in Illinois, and he made bail, but the conditions were tight. Surrender his passport, check in weekly with a pretrial officer, no contact with me whatsoever. He violated that last one 6 weeks in. Unknown number. I answered out of habit, mid-morning, without thinking. Paige, his voice. The sound of it still made my whole body pull tight, the way it does when you recognize a smell you associate with something bad. I just want to explain. You need to stop talking. I kept my voice flat, professional, the same voice I used when I found an error in a vendor contract. This is a violation of your bail conditions. I'm hanging up now and calling my attorney. I was drowning, he said, shifting into the pleading register I knew as well as my own name. The firm was struggling. I was going to pay it back. I love you, if you'd just. Carter, I cut him off. I don't love you. I'm not sure I ever knew you well enough to love you. What I do know is that you hit me, you stole my identity, and you're currently violating a federal bail order. Goodbye. I called Denise before he'd even had time to redial. The number traced to a burner phone, 2 blocks from my new apartment in Logan Square. Because I had moved out of Holden's penthouse by then, into my own 1-bedroom, with south-facing windows and hardwood floors that creaked in the particular way I immediately loved. I'd needed to do that. To prove to myself that I was rebuilding something that belonged to me, not just moving from one safe harbor to another. Holden had understood without me having to explain it more than once, which was something I filed away carefully. The night I moved in, he'd helped carry boxes, even though he'd arranged movers. We ate pizza on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and talked until midnight about nothing in particular, and when I walked him to the door, I said, I need you to know I'm not running from you. I'm running towards something I haven't built yet. He'd looked at me for a long moment. I know the difference, he'd said. Take all the time you need. The trial was in November. I sat in the witness box at the Dirksen Federal Building and answered every question clearly and specifically. The fraudulent accounts, the forged signatures, the 14 months of systematic theft I'd documented, with the precision of someone whose entire job was finding where the numbers didn't match. Carter's attorney tried to suggest I'd authorized everything and was now running a revenge campaign. I'd been prepared for that too. I didn't waver. The jury deliberated for 5 hours, guilty on all counts. I walked out of the courthouse into cold air and stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing. Then I got out my phone and typed a message to Holden. It's done, all counts. His reply came in 30 seconds. I'll have food ready, come over if you want. I wanted. What followed was 6 months of therapy, of learning to trust my own perception again. My therapist, Dr. Okafor, had a way of pointing out the things I'd been trained not to see, the moments I'd minimized, the explanations I'd constructed for behavior that didn't need explaining, only recognizing. You weren't naive, she told me more than once. You were optimistic. There's a difference. Optimism is a feature. It just needs better calibration sometimes. My credit score, which had been a disaster zone, climbed back into the 700s as the fraudulent accounts were removed one by one. The court-ordered restitution would take years to process, but Denise had also secured a civil judgment on top of the criminal verdict, which gave me options Carter hadn't planned for. I threw myself into work. Holden promoted me to Director of Financial Operations, the same role I'd been doing informally for 2 years, finally official, finally mine. I hired 2 analysts, redesigned the quarterly audit process, and stopped apologizing for having opinions in meetings where I was clearly right. Holden and I still had coffee most mornings. Same place on Wacker Drive, same corner table, half an hour that had nothing to do with either of our job titles. We talked about books, about Chicago sports, about my plans to finally visit my sister Cora in Portland, which I'd been putting off for 3 years and finally booked. Go for 2 weeks if you want, he'd said. It's only 1 week. It can be 2, not managing me, just open. The way Holden was open with me, without accounting for where I was every hour. I went for 10 days. Cora picked me up from PDX with her 2 dogs and a bag of groceries she'd made because she remembered that traveling makes me tired and hungry in that specific combination. We sat in her kitchen until 2 in the morning the first night, and I told her everything. Carter, the trial, what came after. Tell me about the other one, she said around midnight. There is no other one. Cora is 4 years older than me, and has a particular look that means I love you, and I'm not letting this go. Tell me about Holden then. I got back from Portland on a Sunday. There were flowers on my doorstep, wild ones, the kind from a roadside stand rather than a florist, in colors that didn't quite match but somehow worked together. The card had one line, "Welcome home, H." I stood in my hallway holding them for longer than was strictly necessary. Monday I was back at the office by 8. Holden was already there, which he always was, standing at the windows with a coffee in hand. He turned when I came in and looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for years. That particular quality of attention that I'd spent 3 years carefully pretending not to notice. "Good trip?" he asked. "Really good." I set my bag down. My heart was doing something complicated and I decided to stop managing it. I did a lot of thinking while I was there. "Yeah?" "About what I want." I crossed the room until I was close enough that there was no professional ambiguity left about what this conversation was. I spent almost a year figuring out who I am when I'm not inside someone else's story. I know now. I looked up at him. I know what I want, too. Holden went very still, the way he went still in high-stakes moments, not frozen but gathered. "I'm not grateful," I said. "I mean, I am. But that's not this. This is just. You're the person I wanted to call when everything fell apart. You were the person I thought about in Portland when Cora asked who actually mattered to me. That's separate from everything else. That's just true." He set his coffee down on the nearest surface. His hand came up to the side of my face, careful, like he'd been waiting to do this for a long time, and wasn't going to rush it now that he could. "I've been waiting for you to be ready," he said. "Not because I had to, because you're worth waiting for." The first time Holden Cross kissed me, it was nothing like anything I'd imagined in the unexamined corners of my mind over 3 years of professional distance. It was better, slower and more deliberate, and when we finally broke apart, both of us were quiet for a moment, and the city was bright through the windows behind him. And I felt something I hadn't felt in so long, I'd almost forgotten the shape of it. Safe, not the absence of threat, the actual presence of something real. Dating Holden was nothing like being with Carter had been. Carter needed to know where I was every hour. Holden told me once that knowing I could go anywhere was the only thing that made it mean something when I chose to come back to him. Carter had chipped away at every interest, every friendship, every piece of me that didn't orbit around him. Holden actively encouraged the opposite, pushed me to finally take the landscape architecture course. I'd been eyeing for years, rearranged his own schedule so I could make Thursday evening classes, asked genuinely good questions about what I was learning. There were complications, the parts of his business that moved through channels I still didn't look at directly occasionally intruded, a late call, a shift in his expression that told me something was happening. I wouldn't be told about. I'd made peace with that. I knew who he was. I'd chosen him with that knowledge, which meant the choice was real. We didn't rush anything. 6 months of dating, of dinners and arguments about which part of the city had the better pizza, of actual life building itself around us. On a night in late spring, standing on his terrace with the lake visible in the distance and the city lit up below, I said, "I think I'm done being careful." He turned from the railing. "Careful how?" "About saying out loud what I want." I looked at him. "I want this, long term, all the way through. I don't want to keep acting like it might not last." Holden reached into the pocket of his jacket, which was either a remarkable coincidence or the most Holden thing he had ever done. A man who prepares for every contingency, and produced a ring, simple, elegant, a round-cut diamond set in a thin gold band. No drama, no performance, just exactly right. "I've been carrying this for 3 weeks, he said, which startled a real laugh out of me. "Waiting for you to get there on your own, because you needed to get there on your own." 3 weeks, I repeated. I wasn't going to push. His eyes were steady on mine. "So, Paige Callahan, you survived something that would have flattened most people, and came out the other side sharper and clearer, and more yourself than when you went in. I have loved watching that happen. I would very much like to watch whatever comes next." He held out his hand. "Marry me, not because I kept you safe, because you kept yourself safe and you're choosing me anyway. That's the only version of this I want." I stepped forward and took the ring, and he slid it onto my finger, and I kissed him before he could say anything else. My sister called that night, which meant Holden had called her first to ask her blessing, old-fashioned and entirely like him. Cora cried. I cried. It was the best kind. Lying in bed, later, watching the ring catch the light from the city below, I thought about the night, months ago, when I'd been on the floor of my apartment and scrolled to a name I'd never called and pressed the button with shaking hands. I'd thought I was asking for rescue. I hadn't been. I'd been asking for enough time to rescue myself. I just needed someone steady enough to hold the door open while I did it. Carter Whitmore was serving 6 years in federal prison. My credit score had climbed back into the 700s. I had a job I'd earned, an apartment I loved, a sister I'd stopped taking for granted, and a man who'd carried a ring in his pocket for 3 weeks because he understood that the timing had to be mine. I'm still figuring things out, honestly. I think that's the part nobody tells you, that you don't arrive somewhere and stop growing. You just get to keep going, but on your own terms this time, with your own name on the lease. And someone who calls you sunshine, like it's just a fact about the world. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.